Good afternoon, everybody. We already had a fulminant morning session, and I'm delighted to welcome you now to our afternoon session on literature and philosophy, on HD, on Stephen King, on Jacques Lacan. So we will first start with the lecture, HD, Freud and the Mental Image, or I guess lecture performance, by Leonard Schwartz, poet and translator from the States, and then continue with the lectures by advisory board member Victor Marzin from St. Petersburg, and the philosopher and psychoanalyst theorist Lorenzo Chiesa from the University of Newcastle. And after each lecture, there will be a mini break like this morning. So let me briefly share some nearly trivial thoughts about absence and philosophy and literature. Aristotle, in turn, writes in De Memoria e Reminiscentia, on memory, on the phantasma as a phenomenon that exists in a constant state between absence and presence, presenting itself simultaneously as true and deceptive. Aristotle also emphasizes the central importance of memory in manifesting the absent when he points out that it is the non-present that is always remembered. When it comes to literature, it is sure that absence is an omnipresent theme throughout the history and has been from the very beginning. It is hardly surprising that absence is the central theme in one of the oldest and most influential works of world literature, Homer's Odyssey. Or if we think of another era, think of one of the most fascinating texts of Middle Ages, Andreas Capellano's treatise De Amore, that tells us that the absence of the beloved is the constitutive element of love because it sparks longing. But not only the thematic function is interesting here, it is art and literature that can go a step further than memory in evoking the absence. As a matter of fact, literature and art dispose of various methods of evoking the absent. Lessing already pointed out in his introduction to Laocoon from 1766 that it is painting and art that present absent things as present. In modernism and in the course of the 20th century, the concept of absence plays an increasingly important role in literature, with literature assuming the role of mediator between the absent and the present. And this is where I would like to stop, or rather zoom in, on one of the leading representatives of the literary moving of Imaginism launched by Ezra Pound, H.D. Hilda Doolittle, who was analyzed by Freud in 1933 and 1934. I quote, "Poetry for her is the art of a gratifying absence, or a would-be gratifying absence at least." This is something you wrote to me, Leonard, in an email. And I'm delighted to introduce you now, Leonard Schwartz, who will bring HD and her engagement with absence to our attention. Please join me in welcoming Leonard. No, I need to introduce you first. Yeah. No. No. So Leonard Schwartz is a poet, essayist, and translator. He's the author of several books of poetry, including most recently Actualities 1, Transparent to the Stone, 2021. Actualities 2, Two Burnt Hotels, 2022. And Actualities 3, Comic Earth, 2023, as well as, and I have it here. You can have a look afterwards. Heavy Sublimation, which came out with Talisman House, and then with the painter Simon Carr, Horse on Paper. His book, The New Babel, towards a poetics of the Mid-East crisis came out in 2016, and it consists of poetry, essays, and interviews. Leonard teaches at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and he divides his time between there and New York City. Last but not least, this is something you mentioned also for your biography. You are also an Austrian citizen. Yeah. So please, Leonard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to use the podium. You'll tell me, do I need the microphone? Can you hear me in the back without the microphone? Okay. If you feel like I can't be heard, just let me know and I will use it. So thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Wilhelm Hemmeke, who's here today. I was here in Vienna in November of last year and at his invitation to do a talk on the poet Paul Celan at the University of Vienna, and he introduced me to Daniel Finzi, and who gave me a wonderful tour of the Freud Museum, at which point I immediately started thinking about the poetics of HD in relationship to the museum. It's really not much of a performance. It is, I'm going to read a paper in a bit, for better or for worse, but I did want to put on this piece of paper, Daniela mentioned Imagism, so the famous poem of Ezra Pound. Oops, sorry, I'm going to start all over. I need to write a little more smaller.
The crossing out.
The station of the metro. Sorry for my handwriting here. I think it is important to write it. I'll read it because my handwriting is awful. So this is the 1916 version of Pound's In a Station of the Metro, which is the title. In a station of the metro, and then the two lines, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And there is indeed a period. So, and again, if it can't be read in the back, I'll just say it again. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So much critical ink spilled on those two lines since 1916. And I have a question for you about that poem at the end. It's not an exam, it's just a question about that poem at the end of the talk. So my talk is entitled HD Bergasse 19 and the Status of the Image, and it has several sections. 1. HD, 1886-1961, is one of the major figures in a lineage of American poetry that seeks to pursue both avant-garde production and the archaic past, making it new at the same instant as it recognizes an it to transform. As opposed to seeking to begin again with a year one, as another kind of avant-gardism might imagine possible, in HD's poetry, the encounter with the energies of the past holds a key to future production. As such, HD, Hilda Doolittle, and her close confederate Ezra Pound, 1885-1972, created poetries with special relationships to time, in which the future can only be created by way of a deep relationship to the revivification of the archaic, less revolutionary than mythopoetical and at times even archaeological. For HD, this meant a deep dive into ancient Greek myth and poetry, as well as into its antecedents in Egyptian myth and religion, both as poetic adopter and as seer, subject to her famous vision of writing on the wall in her hotel room in Corfu in 1920, the disturbing experience of which provided the impetus for her to later seek out Sigmund Freud. Was this vision a sign of madness or a visitation from the absent gods? HD sought out Freud as both analysand and friend during her 3-month stay in Vienna in 1933 and 5-week stay in 1934, strolling over from where she stayed at the Hotel Regis just down the block to visit him here at 19 Bergasse Street. Here they spoke together about the difference between art making and religion making, Freud eliciting H.D. to wonder after herself if she hoped to found a new religion, as opposed to write a visionary poem, which is what she ultimately did, in H.D.'s account of Freud's verbal nudgings. The account is in her book, Tribute to Freud, in which H.D. brings together her reflections on Freud into one work. Clearly, there is a resemblance between H.D.'s pursuit of a deep past to forge a future and the basic structure of Freud's own thinking. Basic introduction to H.D. 2. In the earliest phase of her writing, H.D. was known as an Imagist. One way of glossing Imagism is to say she was part of a movement that placed phanopoesis, the power of language to cast images upon the screen of the mind, at the center of the work of poetry, this poem being one of the prime sort of central pieces of the movement of Imagism, that is focusing on phanopoesis, the power of language to cast images upon the screen of the mind. So too, in her conversations with Freud, a question about the nature of the image and effect comes to the fore. Is the status of the image derived from her waking dream hallucinatory, or instead ontologically revelatory of a being beyond the self? Are images of things absent aspects of a psychological circumstance, or a poetic vision of the invisible that makes the invisible suddenly present? Dream and vision accompany one another, but certainly are not the same thing, and yet dreams rely on the visual feeling. In the book Freud, Bergasse 19, which is the catalog for this museum, Freud Museum director Monica Pesler points out in her piece The Dream, an imaging process, quote, as Sigmund Freud observes in the interpretation of dreams, dreams think essentially in images, and while noises and sounds can at times make their way into our imaginations, our dream lives generally favor the visual. It is also true, end quote, it is also true that the visual in sleep is a closed-eye vision, in the absence of perception, or light, or of things themselves. When the eyes, like doors, open, this vision dissipates in favor of the material world. The objects in the room reappear alongside the questions, where am I, what time is it? Then closed-eye vision gradually fades. We use the word image to refer to many different phenomena. Here we return to the question of reinventing the new out of the ruins of the old. The passage from H.D. I would invite us all to consider most closely is from her poem The Walls Do Not Fall in the book Trilogy, written, quote, for Karnak in 1923 from London in 1942. This is a London under bombardment and threatened by the death principle. H.D. writes, quote from her poem, an incident here and there, and rails gone for guns from your and my Old Town Square, mist and mist gray, no color, still the Luxor bee, chick and hare pursue unalterable purpose in green, rose red, lapis. They continue to prophesize from the stone papyrus. There as here, ruin opens the tomb, the temple. Enter, there as here, there are no doors. The shrine lies open to the sky. The rain falls here, there, sand drifts. Eternity endures, ruin everywhere, yet as the fallen roof leaves the sealed room open to the air, so through our desolation, thought stirs, inspiration stalks us through gloom. End quote. In this section of the poem, for H.D., there are no designated doors, but there is an opening to the sky once the roof has been exploded and the light can pour in. Quote, a shrine lies open to the sky. The ruins of a building become a shrine rather than becoming nothing. A building is dependent on how you see it. Destruction yields up surprising but questionable doors. 3. In the chapter Writing on the Wall in Tribute to Freud, H.D. writes this about her mystical encounter in Corfu in 1920, the event she always referred to as indeed writing on the wall. Quote, The series of shadow or of light pictures I saw projected on the wall of a hotel bedroom in the Ionian island of Corfu at the end of April 1920 belong in the sense of quality and intensity, of clarity and authenticity to the same psychic category as the dream of the Pharaoh's daughter coming down the stairs. For myself, I consider this sort of dream or projected picture or vision as a sort of halfway state between ordinary dream and the vision of those who, for lack of a more definite term, we must call psychics or clairvoyants. End quote. Clearly, the question of a wall is at issue in both 1920, during the vision itself, and in 1942, in the poems The Walls Do Not Fall. Walls are also paramount at the Freud Museum. On the one hand, walls hem us in, trapping us in an inescapable domesticity and family romance, unless they are torn down. On the other hand, there are layers palimpsestically ingrained into the walls, such that the careful reader of the architecture in question might find subtle suggestions of the past or even powerful traces that suggest the possibility of knowledge and energy waiting to be uncovered. Defiantly, walls do not fall during the bombardment of London, even as roofs do, opening the personal to the heavens, as in the H.D. poem. Deliriously, walls in Corfu become screens upon which messages from the absent gods are cast. Again, director Monica Pesler writes about the specific concept of curation at the Freud Museum. Quote, "The marked voids and partially exposed walls that reveal the layers underneath may leave viewers with an uncanny impression. As Freud determined with regard to other things, however, that class of the frightening which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar is also present in the uncanny, and can also refer to, quote, something which is, or quote of a quote, something which is secretly familiar, which has undergone repression and returned from it. In this regard, the exposed original room structures reveal the narratives that substantiate Sigmund Freud's existence and that of his family, par pro toto for the many victims of the Holocaust whose stories had disappeared from the Austrian collective memory for years following the Second World War." End quote. Thus, walls simultaneously enclose as they enforce domesticity, but also reveal openings more enduring than do windows. As such, psychoanalysis, the interpretation of the personal, opens here at its birthplace into the archaeological and the curatorial practices of the transpersonal. H.D. had earlier made such a transpersonal but also transcendental claim for her poetry. H.D.'s mystical experience in a hotel room in Corfu in 1920 does seem a different calling than the curatorial and then the psychoanalytic too, and then the psychoanalytical too. Freud recognized that, but emerges in H.D.'s book as a figure who encourages the art-making function implied by H.D.'s account of writing on the wall, while discouraging the impulse towards cult and the foundation of a new religion he claims to sense a desire for in H.D.'s writing and speech. Judging by H.D.'s book, the poet and the psychoanalyst both consider H.D.'s mystical experience of language projected onto a wall as significant. They tussle over its proper framing. Freud's hostility towards the religious is, of course, famous, yet throughout H.D.'s text, Freud is framed positively by H.D. as a kind of Janus figure. Janus, the Roman god of doorways and thresholds, his two heads facing in opposite directions. For H.D., Freud is Janus, seated in the space between the conscious and the unconscious, the imaginary and the real. H.D. writes, quoting from Tribute to Freud, "This old Janus, this beloved lighthouse keeper, old Captain January, shut the door on transcendental speculations, or at least transferred this occult or hidden symbolism to the occult or hidden regions of the personal reactions, dreams, thought associations, or thought transferences of the individual human mind," end quote. Or again, H.D. on Freud as Janus, quote, "Janus faced two ways as doors and gates opened and shut. Here in this room we had our exits and entrances." My personal association here is with Janus Films, the sole distributor of foreign films, so-called foreign films in the U.S. for over 60 years, without which Americans would never see anything but Hollywood. All hail Janus, January's namesake, beginning of the year and dead of winter, god of doorways, thresholds, and film distribution. Doors, then, as well as walls. For H.D., doors become mystical, perhaps as gates are in Kafka, whereas for Freud, doors are presumably material and use-oriented. Yet again, in the Freud Museum's catalog book, Freud Bergasse 19, it is pointed out that, quote, 50 of the total 200 dreams that Freud studied in the interpretation of dreams were his own, the majority of which were dreamt in this very room, i.e. Freud's former bedroom, now a room in this museum. The room has doors into 4 others. Which is to say, the bedroom here is the room with the most doors. Is that accurate? Is the bedroom the room with the... That is accurate, right? Which is to say, the bedroom here is the room with the most doors, from which libido and sleep can enter and exit the most variously into private and professional spaces of different kinds. Indeed, to be in a doorway or on a threshold is a curious circumstance of absence and of presence, absent to the spaces of both rooms, present to the possibilities of both. And Cecilia and I were talking last night a little bit about exile being, on the one hand, a boon because you can see clearly into both rooms, and on the other hand, you're not in either of those rooms at all. You're at the threshold always. To be on the threshold of something is to be at the beginning of something, which seems a consciousness oriented towards a future. Yet a doorway can open onto a room laden with memories, filled with the bounty or burden of the past. How imagine oneself as always in the doorway, as a creature of the threshold, subject of Janus and the new year in depths of winter? How think about a bedroom with 4 doors into different kinds of spaces as both personal source and ontological temple? An image is a kind of absence because it is not the thing it pictures. A mental image, or better yet, a thought image, is doubly absent to both the object itself and the perception of an object. And yet that image is a kind of presence because it makes what is absent awaken in cognition. An image conjured by language is a threshold or a doorway, in a way a concept cannot be, because a concept is more determinate, while an image can be a threshold to the concept or to the thing. Visuality in the absence of optical experience is visionary. Poetry asks us to consider these modalities as part of a language mysticism, as the poem shifts from image modality to image modality. For H.D., what happens in Corfu is understood as a relationship to a special kind of image making. For Freud, it is understood, H.D. writes, as a desire for union on her part with her mother. Of course, as a writer, Freud too drew deeply from Greek myth, whether in the discovery of the Oedipus complex or the famous evocation of Eros and Thanatos in Civilization and its Discontents. 3. The term projection, which H.D. used in the quote from Tribute to Freud above, light projected on the wall, has special psychoanalytic, cinematic, and poetic meanings, depending on the context. H.D.'s writing on the wall is, after all, a waking, not a sleeping encounter, such that a distinction must be made between dream images and waking images, as well as between physical images derived from perception and mental images or thought images derived from acts of language that involve, strictly speaking, very little optical input, the reader's eyes arched downwards halfway to sleep. In her book, The Transmutation of Love and Avant-Garde Poetics, literary theorist Jean Houving writes, quote, "For projective love poets, worthy or serious art does not emerge as mere fantasizing or fictitious language, but is connected to the rigors of actual desire and love. Projective love writing places its credence or ethos with perception, propelling perception in an ongoing process of poetic composition," end quote. For Houving, H.D. is one of the great projective love poets. The notion of projective here it relied on is one drawn from the poet Charles Ulson in his famous projective verse essay of 1950. Houving glosses Ulson's projective verse this way, quote, "Most useful to my analysis from Ulson's projective verse is his emphasis on the dispensation of the poet as one in which he or she attempts to, quote, get rid of the lyrical interference of the individual as ego," end quote. Again, continuing with Houving as opposed to Ulson, and on the discussion of a writing practice in which one perception must immediately and directly lead to a further perception. This then puts the poet, in Olson's words, in the open, and within a writing practice in which they can, quote, go by no track other than the one the poem underhand declares for itself. This engagement involves the poet in the kinetics of the thing. The syllable, the line, as well as the image, the sound, the sense, must be taken up as participants in the kinetics of the poem just as solidly as we are accustomed to take what we call the objects of reality. In such a practice, the poet is not only the agent of the poem, but also its medium, and language is both material and medium. It is Huving's further contention that this poetry of the kinetics of language finds its antecedent in the kind of projective love and libidinized field poetics modeled in H.D.'s earlier writing. However spiritualized H.D.'s poetry may appear by comparison to Olson's rhetoric of energy, the speed of perception, etc. The way in which the word image is employed is what is at stake here, between the one view of the personal lyric and the other view of language as an impersonal spontaneity the poet rides towards the real. The interpreter of dreams, Freud, examines the images of the dream as ciphers of personal signification. Not so the poet, H.D., possessed by the kinetics of the poem that reveals the outside, in Jack Spicer's formulation or in Rilke's formulation, the clearing. The poem consists of mental the poem consists of mental images, to be sure, steeped in the absence of the form they name. But are they personal indexes or figures generated by the kinetics of composition in language, or traces left behind by the invisible, or else the veritable divinities themselves? The poem, made of language, Janus-like, is a doorway or a threshold between these spaces, one that honors absence and suggests the possibility of presence. Whether in her early Imagist phase or in her later palimpsestic and mythopoetic work, especially The Walls Do Not Fall in Trilogy, or her poem Helen in Egypt, the image, the absence of the thing itself, but the desire to make it appear present, is at the heart of H.D.'s project. In The Walls Do Not Fall, London is under bombardment in the early 40s, and from the ruined cityscape, otherwise absented forms emerge. In H.D.'s epic poem, reconceiving Homer's The Iliad, Helen in Egypt, the Greeks and Trojans are fighting over an absent Helen. Helen herself long having decamped Troy for Egypt, where she leads her own very interesting life. The men in Troy fighting now over control of an image, her absent being, which to say the sex symbol, not the actual woman. This is a telling of events that has classical antecedents, but H.D. makes it new and richer in her telling. Is to stand on a threshold or in a doorway to be absent in both rooms. Come in, be here with us. An invitation is cheerfully extended. One enters and becomes part of the company. To stand awkwardly in the doorway is to awaken to the possibility of being present in both rooms, to make no claim to belonging in either. Even in Homer's Iliad, Helen stands on the ramparts, describing her former kinsmen, the thronged Greeks out on the battlefield, to pry on her current father-in-law. Freud is not Helen, but this might also be the professor on the ramparts, loosening the knot of that one ineluctable room so that one can observe the other room. Or perhaps it is the poem that seeks to maintain its reader on the threshold, not inviting a reader all the way into the illusion of some fixed meaning, but playing off of language's indeterminacies. As the Freud Museum itself makes clear, doorways are both definite and mysterious. 4. In Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud writes, quote, an extremely ancient language and script, which however is still used by 400 million people, is the Chinese. You must not suppose that I at all understand it. I only obtained some information about it because I hope to find analogies in it to the indefiniteness of dreams. Nor has my expectation been disappointed. The Chinese language is full of instances of indefiniteness, which might fill us with alarm. As is well known, it consists of a number of syllabic sounds which are spoken either singly or combined into pairs. It is even more interesting from the point of view of our comparison to learn that this language has practically no grammar. It is impossible to tell of any of the monosyllabic words whether it is a noun or a verb or an adjective, and there are no verbal inflections by which one could recognize gender, number, termination, tense, or mood. Thus the language consists, one might say, solely of the raw material, just as our thought language is resolved by the dream work into its raw material,
and any expression of relations is omitted. It must, of course, be admitted that the system of expression by dreams occupies a far more unfavorable position than any of these languages and scripts." End quote. Freud's comments on the Chinese language are intriguing, even if his interest in the subject of Chinese language is, I believe, fleeting. But there it is in Freud's text, the invocation of a language whose indefiniteness offers an analogy to the language of dream, and whose provenance is ancient, its phonic expression dependent on context and framing. Moreover, there is little or no straitjacketing syntax, such that the mind is free to explore multiple interpretations, again, dependent on context. I bring up Freud's comment on the Chinese language because H.D.'s closest poet in arms, Ezra Pound, sometime lover, sometime mentor, inventor of H.D. as nom de plume for Hilda Doolittle, spent the first years of the 20th century exploring the Chinese language as a source for the new American poetry, its archaic standing offering a key to unlocking his language from the encumbrances of British ornamentalism, the better to arrive at an American English as a language of that new poetry. We refer to the period between 1914 and 1918 as H.D. and Pound's Imagist phase. It is true that Pound dwelled on the ideographic and visual elements of the Chinese language in a way that Freud does not in this passage, and that he tended to value direct communication as opposed to indeterminacy and mystery in the way H.D. valued them, as did Freud in his own way. It is also true that H.D. spent much of her career attempting to emerge from Pound's shadow. The consultations with Freud may have been helpful to her in this regard, stepping from one room into a room of her own. Yet Freud's comments on the Chinese language are consonant with the early 20th century attraction H.D. and Pound felt to a certain form of language the Chinese embodied for them, and that Viennese-born theorist of the American avant-garde, Marjorie Perloff, called a poetics of indeterminacy in her book of that same title. The first section of H.D.'s The Walls Do Not Fall, that I was reading earlier, ends thusly. The bone frame was made for no such shock knit within terror, yet the skeleton stood up to it. The flesh, it was melted away, the heart burnt out, dead ember, tendons, muscles shattered, outer husk dismembered, yet the frame held. We passed the flame. We wonder, what saved us? What for? End quote. H.D.'s poetry plumbs a mythic past and posits that something does not fall. The city survives the bombing. It doesn't appear to be the person, the self, or even the body that survives, but a certain energy, as in Olson. More precisely, it is an image that survives if one looks for it. Let me juxtapose H.D.'s poem next to another quote from Freud, Bergasse 19. In her piece in that catalog entitled Exhibiting Freud, Reflections on the New Permanent Exhibition at the Sigmund Freud Museum, curator Daniela Finzi opens by asking us to reflect on a particular image, a painting by Boston artist Louis Kronberg of a young woman deeply absorbed in her knitting, keeping in mind that our English word text comes from Latin textus, as in textile, such that writing and weaving have a common root. Finzi's piece on the Freud Museum ends by moving from image to time, drawing attention to a seminal figure in the German literary tradition, Thomas Mann. Finzi writes, quote, Mann's remarks on, amongst others, Freud's sense of truth and his appreciation of illness as a means of acquiring knowledge are preceded by a title that is a statement as much as it is an appeal. The museum's visitors encounter it in narrow capital letters on the pale original paperback binding, Freud in the Future. In spite of the fact that the gaze of psychoanalysis is turned towards the past, into childhood, he said, quote, the concept of the future was the one he, Thomas Mann, associated most easily and most spontaneously with the name of Freud. And in this, we follow Thomas Mann. This is Daniela Finzi still. Our new permanent exhibition, which does without virtual reality or immersive media, also employs the concept of the future in the sense of untimeliness, contrary to our time, and yet with an influence on it for the benefit, it may be hoped, of a future time. If we keep in mind that museum has its roots in the muse, perhaps in Clio, the muse of history, though all the muses are daughters of Mnemosyne or memory, and that HD remembers deep into the mythopoetic past in order to step into the future, then one begins to see a near rhyme between the poetics of HD and possibly that of Bergasse 19, the Freud Museum. Just short of the certainties of religious transcendence, are those images, wavering and creased by rumination, fragility, and personal doubt, that nonetheless allow us to make contact with the impalpable. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'll ask my question after.
Okay. So thank you so much, Leonard, for this wonderful lecture. I think it's always it's great to hear poetry here at Bergasse 19, and I don't know if you have already discovered, or you all, that we have some poetry also in the permanent exhibition, different boxes of poetry. It's for children, but it's also for adults, of course. And we thought it is a beautiful mean to tell Freud's story with the means of language of poetry. Questions, remarks, comments. Ladies first, Cecilia.
Well, thank you, Leonard, for taking us in such a traveling of our imagination. You cradle us up there somewhere. That was just wonderful, wonderful. And I have many questions, but I won't. I will come back to you because. But I am very interested in that poetic of indeterminacy and your connection to the dream. It just made me think of, in chapter 6, Freud says that the dream doesn't judge, doesn't think, it only expresses. It's a transformation of a form, and it's like a transduction to change something into something else, like we do with a auditory wave, for instance, hitting our ear, we transform it. That is the process of transduction. And I think that we need to keep the expression indeterminate in our understanding of the dream. I think that sometimes we rush to give meaning and we close the dream. But if we remind ourselves that that's there to express, which is a very different idea. It doesn't think and it doesn't judge. And I think that I'm going to read that Poetic of Indeterminacy book that you mentioned, because this is a very valuable idea. I don't know if I got it right, but I seem to have read somewhere that Freud left the door open from his study to his consulting room. Was always open. And so you remind me of that. It's like the threshold is there. Like imaginary part of the session.
In the photographs Monica Pesler showed us yesterday, the doors were always open. The doors were wide open.
And
right?
also on the photographs of Engelmann, you can see. And there was only in the treatment room a stove. And in the study was nuns. So there was practical reason to let the
Yeah. I also want to say in response to the problem of the rush to meaning is such a problem, right? A speaker this morning invoked the idea of slow time in art, that a kind of art that slows time down. You invoked that idea of slow time, right? And I think that's really, Olson, who I cited, who was interested in speeding things up as fast as possible. But I think by this point in late capitalism, the subversive thing to do would be to slow time down, such that we didn't need to consume other items, but we could dwell with what we're thinking about in the moment, right? So I think there is an imperative to slow time down as opposed to, and even as far as the creation of meaning. In poetry, I think of the words as the lightning, they strike, and meaning is thunder that comes at a time, in whatever that time interval is, afterwards. And sometimes not at all, right? Sometimes there's lightning without thunder, but that one has to go with the poem as a kinetic, energetic, linguistic act, and then wait for meaning to rumble, or a thunderclap that might come at some later moment.
Sounds precedes sense.
Sounds precede sense, yeah.
Hi. I mean, maybe I have a question that sort of maybe just to begin with another poet that's sort of a post-Poundian poet, and that's Pasolini. And there just was striking connections where, you know, in a poem where he sort of positions the poet as being at once, as he puts I am a force of the past, and precisely at the same time more modern than the moderns. So that, in other words, the poet has to, in other words, occupy this impossible threshold. And for Pasolini, he became, we could say, increasingly concerned that there was precisely nothing that would survive, let's say, the bombing. In other words, there would be no ruin. Even the ruin itself would be effaced. And he saw this as basically being his more pessimistic diagnosis of contemporary capital. So I guess I'm kind of curious how, how you sort of think about that if one's faced with this problem, you know, that in other words, the poem has to deal with a trace that is precisely a trace of of something that can be not made present, like, you know, a past that is impossible to actually be rendered present.
Yeah, that's really an interesting question. Pasolini is an interesting poet, and
Pasolini and Pound and H.D. are not alone. There's a whole element of the international avant-garde that sees the necessity of going back towards an archaic signifier in order to be able to move forward towards a future tense, right? To sort of go way back in order to get out of the circumstance of the moment and create a future. In Pasolini's case, a poet, but also a filmmaker, and so his version of Oedipus and his version of the Medea, he made a film on Medea, he made a film on Oedipus, are really intriguing in terms of the ways in which he goes about linking those myths to things in Catholicism, to things in his own homoeroticism. I make the distinction all the time between myth and mythology. Mythology is a coffee table book in which it's all settled. We know what each god and goddess is, whereas myth is active and susceptible to transformation and change, to the new telling. So when I think of Pasolini, I think of a vigorous relationship to a mythic tradition that he's attempting to reinvent. As far as the question of whether the past is irretrievable, there is this kind of built-in optimism to the particular American version of that. Jed Rusula, in his book, This Compost, Ecological Imperatives in American Poetry, points out that some of the seminal moments in American poetry, as opposed to British or other European poetries, are in the late 19th century and correspond to the discovery of Babylonian, Mesopotamian texts, Epic of Gilgamesh, and many, many others that had been inaccessible for multiple thousands of years. And so he makes the argument that American poetry seized on that and has a relationship to something even more archaic and ancient than European culture, right? And that's a way of getting out of the sense of dependency on a British tradition. So it's interesting to think about a particular American sense of the possibility of accessing a deep mythopoetic past on the basis of a certain archaeological circumstance, that those texts became available just when American poetry was beginning to happen.
Okay, there was a question.
Thanks, Leonard, for a very poetic essay as well. I was interested in the relationship between the temporal and the spatial in your essay and in your discussion of the Imagist. So you began with the assertion of the temporal in Imagism itself, and then moved more towards the spatial, which was a nice pivot, and I enjoyed that. So if we think of the temporal as the way it's kind of built through the Imagist, with Pound's notion of the image, if I'm remembering correctly, image as a condensation of meaning and time. And then if we think of the avant-gardist gesture, trying to excavate an unexamined past and bring it into to create a new future. A future, of course, that's obscured by the present in that kind of avant-gardist tradition. So I'm just wondering if I could ask you to speculate on the spatial aspect of, or a spatial poetics of the Imagist, particularly prompted by your invocation of the Pound poem, which we could also look at as a very poignant moment in emergent poetics of an urban poetics as well. So just to bring those two things together in the way that you did within your essay.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting and challenging question. You know the transformation music in Wagner's Parsifal, which begins the last line of the text before we go into the music, is here space transforms into time, right? That's and then there's a orchestration after that, and then there's a movement towards a ritual. It turns out to be an empty ritual. Parsifal isn't enlightened by it, but nonetheless a ritual. And so here space turns into time. I tried to tailor this talk to the Freud Museum because Daniel Finzi gave me a wonderful tour last November, and I was thinking about that idea of not filling the space with informational placards and billboards and so on that would sort of tell us a story, but requiring us to search for, to borrow a title from Proust, and search for lost time, to look for time in the spaces. The little bit of wallpaper that's showing through from 1912, or the little bit of window framing that is clearly from when Freud was living here, and so on. That if we look closely enough at space, or we go through a certain kind of ritual circumstance, either way by way of music or theater or poetry or speech, space does turn into time. So the closer one looks at something that's materially spatial, the closer one comes to a temporal experience of it. For Kant, space and time are the a priori preconditions of experience itself. They're practically one another from the start in that tradition, right? You can't experience space perceptually, you can't experience time perceptually, but they're the a priori preconditions for experience itself, and that maybe there are projects of curation, projects of poetry, projects of psychoanalytic practice that allow them to overlap in some way. At least maybe that's what some of us are trying to accomplish. I don't know, is that responsive to your question?
Yeah. This was a thread that I just wanted to attach within your text that I wanted to.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? In a station of the metro, which is Paris Metro, the subway, the first line is the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Apparition meaning potentially a ghost or something that appears. Presumably we're on a subway platform. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. Bough being the tree limb that's jutting out. Big limb as a bough. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. What happens in terms of thought image or mental image? What does one see in the poem? This is what H.D. and Pound are both interested in, the complexity of the image. Jeff, you want to say something? I think you know this poem.
I'm smiling because this is like a classic entry into 20th century poetics.
It is. It's these two little lines, right? And so much has been said about them, and we're still puzzling in poetics or poetry over those lines.
It's interesting to think of this as the urban moment, but then the famous H.D. poem, which I don't quite have committed to memory, but whirl up pointed pines, which is an image of a singular pine tree on a rock, maybe from Corfu, who knows. But so you have a kind of urban and a rural image being constructed from two of the most famous Imagist poets. So unfortunately, this poem gets taught often as urban alienation.
Oh, no, way off, way off. I mean, the first line is urban, but the second line is, quote, rural, it's of a tree. And it's important to note that the poem is in the apparition of these faces in the crowd, like petals on a wet black bough. Had I written that, or if I crossed out and put in the word like, and the second line became a simile in relationship to the first, that would be wallpaper. That would really sort of ruin the poem, right? So there's a tension here between an urban image and a rural image. And the construction, or the image construction, is based in the semicolon. It's very important I got that semicolon in there, right? Because if you take the semicolon out, then it becomes the second line is illustrative of the first, or the first is illustrative of the second. So the semicolon acts as to hold this ambiguity in place between those two lines. Sure, we project in the second line maybe a simile for the first, but it's not there in the poem. The poem leaves that open as one of multiple indeterminacies, or one of multiple possibilities, honoring the indeterminacy of how this hits the mind and how this hits the mind, and how the semicolon, the juxtaposition, the jump cut between the first line and the second line play in the mind. So image construction.
Just very briefly, if you step back and come back to those lines, what you feel is the contrast of the texture, as you said, urban, harsh, and those petals are the most fragile thing that you can conceive. And so is the texture, is the expression of a contrast between that fragility and on a wet, right? So there is like some connection to life somewhat maintained, because they are not dry petals, they still have a chance in this fast-moving train.
No, absolutely. I think that comma between wet and black is huge, that pause, right? Wet, black, bow, because wet is life associational. Right. Black has many associations, but one is surely that of death. So you get that pause between them. Petals on a wet, black bough. In a station of the metro puts us in the underground, dare I say the underworld. Yeah. And so the underworld sense is reinforced by the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Am I in the underworld surrounded by the dead? And then after the semicolon, there's this image of a tree. What tree, we don't know, but we can make associations about the tree. And then, as you said, the wet and the black. The poem has no pronoun, the poem has no verb. The poem, yet, in spite of having no verb, has lots of movement and action. In spite of having no pronoun, has a sense of subjective pregnancy to it. So that has something to do, again, with the movement between the first line and the second line. This is close to what Freud was saying about, quote, the indefiniteness of Chinese, that Pound wanted to incorporate into poetry by working against the structures of syntax that would require us to be binary, or require us to be determinate in a way that he wanted to try and overcome through structures like this.
Very shortly, it's not a question. It's not a question, but it's something before birth, I see. Before birth, yes.
Please, can you
yes.
explain? Can you say more about before birth?
Yes, because it's underground, but then the wet comes. It's I don't know all the association, and it's I feel it like a birth canal. It can be also. So it's not pushing down, but it's wanted to go out.
Fantastic. No, it's this image
Construction, how we construct the image in the mind, that I think that I think H.T. Pound and I think Freud are interested in, how we construct the image, which is not a concept that has to be delineated. That's why I say the image is on the threshold of the concept. It could become a concept, but not yet. Or the image may be on the threshold of the real object that it's naming. In this case, for you, a birth, the process of the inconvenience of being born, as Neil Sierron put it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Angela, yes?
Just a quick comment about the second line, which I think has the contours of a whole relationship. One is in the subway, and out of the crowd, faces emerge. One studies the image, the real. One has fantasies about this individual or individuals, and then one has to say goodbye forever because they're unknown again. And it's quite an experience to take in emotionally a person on the subway and live through that and then leave.
So someone steps onto the subway, you immediately fall in love with them, and then 3 stops later they get off and they're gone, and it's over, and that was it. Yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
So before I close this wonderful session, let us come back to Tribute to Freud. Tribute and Freud. We also have it here in the library. The German version is interesting because we also have the letters by Freud, which he sent to Doolittle. And as you were quoting our catalog so much, as a matter of fact, for Monica and me, it was really, Tribute to Freud is not about the result, about the analysis, but it's about her experience and the impressions, but it's also a lot about the spatial impressions and the atmosphere she felt at Bergasse 19, and this was really a very, very important tool for us to work with. So one very last question, because you said that Freud may have helped her to find her own room, or a room for her own. So this would be my question. Could you say that there is a change, or what kind of development within her poetic work after her analysis with Freud? Is there something which you could say this may have, without speculating, but just the work itself and its formal aspects? Yeah.
I think so. I think it was
Pound who formulated the idea of Imagism and anointed H.D. as the Sappho of Imagism, the new great poet of this Imagistic movement. And that to be elevated and put on a pedestal like that is problematic, right? So in her later work, I cited Helen in Egypt, I cited The Walls Do Not Fall and Helen in Egypt, which are both later works, not from the Imagistic phase. There's more of a palimpsestic relationship to the image. There's more of a, this has its complexities, but on its face, it looks direct, like a direct appearance of the image. H.D. moved more in a direction of a labyrinthine quality to the writing, which I can speculate comes from her in time with Freud, right? Where there is a labyrinth, you're trying to work your way through a complex cluster of recollections and images to get to the source of the trauma, or the source of the repressed or sublimated truth. So I speculate in that this encounter with another sort of dominant or another kind of charismatic and authoritative male figure, Freud, still probably gave her some leverage on the one she'd been dealing with prior to that, Pound, that allowed her to move forward to her mature poetics. The poems from the early Imagist phase, as Professor Dirksen mentioned earlier, are terrific. But I think her later work in Helen in Egypt is the mature work, and I think the Freudian influence was an important part of it.
Okay, let's close on this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.